Here is Noodler's Squeleague, a teal ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
This is a beautiful dark teal with only slight hints of a blue, which on yellow Rhodia paper at the end really gives an outstanding green-leaning turquoise look to it. Now there is some tone variation as the pen and paper change, and sometimes even you might want to take note of the changes. It does generally give a light seasoning of shading throughout all of the writing samples. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the tone shift may be a disappointment to you, so you must be on guard before committing to writing with this in whatever notebook that might be. Now, teal and turquoise inks just aren't my thing, but this is a very good one, especially for those people that like teal and turquoise. It's just not for me. A Sailor 1911 large ringless epinard with a fine nib.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
We have a really dark, interesting teal with no feather, with no spread. It shades very well. I mean, take a look at had passed on the second line, where the H is quite a bit darker than the ad at the end. And when you get to past, the loop of the P is darker than the downstroke from that P, which, normally I see those downstrokes for me being much darker. The ASSE right in the middle lightened just a little bit, but that D at the end became very dark and really stood out. This is looking very nice. And again, teal and turquoise, not my thing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily continue our notes back here.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Noodler's Black Eel. Here is Noodler's Blue Eel. Here is Noodler's Radler Red Eel. Here is Noodler's Turquoise Eel.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
We have a tone that is a little bit lighter, a little bit flatter, and a slight bit more towards green as this teal. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. I see some shading more from word to word. Wind is quite dark, but was on the second line is quite a bit lighter. When you take a look at shifted on the first line, that's where you get to see a little bit more of the tone variation in a word. Like the top of the F is dark or lighter than the bottom of the F that darkened up a little bit. But for the most part, I'm seeing one word being a little bit lighter than the next, which then gets darker. So the shading happens as a word-to-word case. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily continue our notes back here, making everybody happy.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
We see a tone shift here where it really pushes much more towards a green, probably a result of the tone of the paper, showing that this could be a little bit more translucent as an ink. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It is shading better than it did on the last paper. Not that it's being huge and stand out. If you take a look at host on the second line, where the H and T on the outsides are a little bit darker than the OS in the middle, but report on the second line is a very dark word the whole way through, where was just above it on this first line, just a tad bit lighter. Again, keeping that shading being more a word-to-word thing. Looking at the back of the page, nothing bled through to touch the page underneath. I have to start with that because there are some spots where we can see the ink got very deep into the paper. Could you write back here? Most people probably could. I probably wouldn't, because once this starts to happen, I normally don't do it. I don't feel like having any kind of distraction.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
We get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It stands out without any kind of problems against the quad rule. Not a surprise. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade in the same way that it did on the Clairfontaine. So not huge as a standout quality, but definitely there. When you take a look at hastening on the first line, where the HA is a little bit darker than the S that lightened up a little bit into that T. The ENING at the end darkened just a tad, and I'm saying all of this is just a tad. Looking at the back of the page, there's no surprises that there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is 3 Oysters Graoul Hanoil.
Here is Ackerman, their number 11. Here is Birmingham Pen Company, Point Park Fountain Turquoise. Here is Califolio Blue Lagoon.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
This is lighter and flatter and more green leaning than it was on the Clairfontaine. You probably would think of this more as a green than as a teal, the way it's appearing here. Now, it stands out against the quad rule with no problem. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. It shades more than I expected when you look at expected on the first line, where the E is lighter than that X, that just X lightened up some. The P got darker into the EC, but the T got even darker still, lightening up a little bit into that ED at the end. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Autumn Oak. Here is Diamine Purple Pizzazz. Here is KWZ Warsaw Dreaming.
Here is Sailor Studio 730. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
This is still a teal, which I really was expecting some color shift on this paper. Still very much a teal, lighter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a tiny bit. It spreads a tiny bit. It doesn't shade. This is very workable on this paper. There's only really exceedingly on the third line that looks bad. Otherwise, I'd say this really performed incredibly well on the copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, it did get deep into the paper. Not as bad as we've seen, but bad enough that I would not write back here. Not bad enough to touch the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The dry writing fine nib of this Sailor 1911 ringless can show more flaws in an ink than, say, a wet fine. So the tone shift, which is slight as the paper changes, and the light shading can be avoided if you wanted to. You could use a little wetter pen, get much more consistent performance. Off camera, I used it in a wet fine and got a darker tone with no shading, and it did look really nice on the page. But I liked the tone from this dry fine, just wanted a tiny bit more shading. So for this, I would go for a drier broad or stub to really bring out that shading.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.